Last 24 hours have seen a lot of fighting on the Ukrainian battlefronts, but I'm going to say that, in my opinion, the actual scale of the fighting may be starting to diminish as Ukraine has burnt through many of the resources that it put together in advance of its spring-summer offensive. This is, of course, as is always the case, on my part, an impression. I can't confirm what has happened, but nonetheless, that is the impression which overall I have. So firstly, what did happen yesterday? Well, first, what didn't happen? In my program yesterday, I spoke about talk about a Ukrainian attempt to carry out some kind of large amphibious operation across the Dnieper River, crossing troops from the west bank of Kherson region, of the Dnieper in Kherson region, to the east bank of the Dnieper on Kherson region. And there were reports, scattered reports of Ukrainian boats crossing the Dnieper, being shelled, in some cases no doubt destroyed, by Russian artillery. And again, the Russians talk about losses on the part of Ukraine in these kind of assaults. But I don't get the impression that this amounted to a large assault by Ukraine. It seems that these rather small attacks have been trying to establish some kind of a bridgehead on the east bank, but this has never really been successful. When Ukrainian troops have landed on the east bank, they've been able to control a small amount of territory for perhaps a short time, but the Russians always manage to contain it. Sometimes the Ukrainian troops get cut off, sometimes fighting continues and the Russians roll them up, but never have the Ukrainians managed to establish a beachhead large enough for a large amphibious assault force. I should say that the geography, to some extent, actually favors the Ukrainians in this part of the battlefront, in that the west bank of the Dnieper is significantly higher than the east bank, where the Russians are. That means that the Russians have to have their units, their military units, positioned some distance from the actual river itself, and that does create a small space which, in theory at least, the Ukrainians could use to try to establish a beachhead. But this has never successfully happened, and one gets the impression that it's proving extremely difficult and very costly for Ukraine whenever they try. Before I finish this topic, it's been suggested by several people, Slavyangrad, for example, Boris Rozhin, these are of course Russians, that one of the purposes in the destruction of the Novaya Kakhovka dam was to destroy the minefields that the Russians laid on the east bank, on that part of the east bank that they could not occupy because they kept their troops further back, and that it is the destruction of these minefields that was the actual principal objective of the destruction of the dam, and which has allowed the Ukrainians to try to carry out these assaults, even though, as I've said, up to this point, the assaults have not been successful. At least they've not established a bridgehead. They've not been successful in that respect. Anyway, attacks across the Dnieper by Ukraine, small numbers of troops, no bridgehead established. There were other attacks by Ukraine along the southern front lines. Apparently there was one on the Vremevki ledge again. I get the sense that that didn't go terribly well. Again, pictures of Ukrainian armored vehicles destroyed. And there have been lots of reports of heavy fighting again in the Bakhmut area. The word before, as I discussed in my program yesterday, was of a Russian counterattack in the Kleshchevka area, which had pushed the Ukrainians back. The Ukrainians then went back on the attack in the Kleshchevka area near Bakhmut. Another time, they made lots of attempts to storm Kleshchevka over the last few weeks, going all the way back to May, in fact, to before Bakhmut's actual fall. In every case, up to now, including yesterday, the Ukrainians were repelled with very heavy losses, and it seems after the initial attack, the Russians mounted a counterattack of their own and recaptured some of the ground that the Ukrainians temporarily gained in this particular counterattack. Overall, from what I can gather, the front lines in this area, in Kleshchevka, Kurdumyovka, these villages to the south of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, that the situation remains basically static. Further north, the Russians made significant advances yesterday. Today, it seems, as far as I can tell, that they are reorganizing. There's some villages, apparently, that they want to capture, one particular village that they want to capture. I'm not entirely sure where it is, by the way. I'm never good, as I said, at reading maps. But anyway, it's clear that in the north, the Russians still hold the initiative, and the reports are that the Ukrainians are trying to pull troops together to try to shift them back towards this area where the fighting has, as I said, turned against them, where the Russians overall hold the initiative. Where those Ukrainian troops are coming from, by the way, is not clear, but I did see a report that Bradley vehicles were used in the Liman area. Now, I'm not absolutely clear that this is the case. Supposedly there's a photograph, but I'm not sure that it is a photograph of a Bradley. And of course, it might not be, if it is a Bradley, a photograph actually made in the Liman area. But if it is the case, then it would suggest that the Ukrainians are redeploying some of the troops from the southern front lines to the Liman area to try to hold the Russians back. And some of those troops are coming with the infantry fighting vehicles, the Bradleys, that they were supposed to be using in the south. But as I said, don't put too much weight on this. I'm not really sure about this redeployment or about the use of this Bradley in this particular area. So anyway, overall, a fairly static front line. Heavy fighting yesterday, of that there is no doubt. Lots of people being killed, but my overall sense is that after another spike in activity around the time of the Vilnius summit, we're perhaps in a slightly quieter period, though of course it may be the case that the Ukrainians may be planning or thinking of doing something else. One thing I would say is that, going back to that article by Seymour Hersh that I discussed yesterday, in which the options or lack of options and the political struggles in Washington were discussed in some detail in light of the overall failure up to now of the Ukrainian offensive. There was something that Seymour Hersh said, which is that once the Russians, I'm quoting from memory, the Russians repel the Ukrainian offensive with ease, then of course they will be in a position to go on the offensive themselves. I very much doubt that the Russian troops who are busy dealing with this Ukrainian offensive would describe their work as easy. There's no doubt at all that the Russians have taken casualties. By the standards of the war, from the Russian side, I suspect heavy casualties. There's been some very intense fighting, and Ukraine, of course, has engaged the Russians with some very heavy shelling, and in this war, it is the shelling that kills. So I doubt that the Russians find dealing with this Ukrainian offensive easy. At least the troops on the front line, I am sure, don't. And of course, from the Ukrainian point of view, conducting this offensive has been appallingly difficult, tragically so. And you are beginning to see some of the signs of stress on the Ukrainian side. Now, I say that the British Ministry of Defence has published another piece which talks about Russian commanders, officers starting to criticise their commanders. This is very much centred around General Popov's comments that I talked about, which were intended to be private. No doubt there is some of that, but as I've said previously, the British Ministry of Defence and the British media haven't talked about the many, many more expressions of criticism and dismay and distress on the Ukrainian side from junior commanders. But General Zaluzhny, the overall Ukrainian commander, on the 13th of July, gave an interview for the Washington Post, which, in my opinion, showed something of the stress that he now finds himself under. And I'm going to just briefly quote some of his words. First of all, he expressed his extreme frustration about the fact that Western powers are trying to limit Ukraine's ability to carry out attacks on Russian territory. He says this is our problem, and it is up to us to decide how to kill this enemy. It is possible and necessary to kill on its territory in a war. Actually, if our partners are afraid to use their weapons, we will kill with our own, but only as much as is necessary. And he then went on to say, to save my people, why do I have to ask someone for permission what to do on enemy territory? For some reason, I have to think that I'm not allowed to do anything there. Why? Because Russian dictator Vladimir Putin will use nuclear weapons. The kids who are dying don't care. Well, that's all very well for Zaluzhny to say. He's obviously anxious to launch lots of attacks on Ukraine, on Russian territory. Of course, Ukraine has actually launched attacks on Ukrainian territory, but I suspect that what this is all about is warnings from Britain, France, and possibly the United States that Ukraine should not use its long-range missiles, its Storm Shadow missiles, and the similar Scalp missiles that the Western powers have provided, and perhaps the ATACMS missiles, to try to launch missile strikes on Russian territory. And Zaluzhny is furious about this, and he's angrily complaining. But I would point out that, again, he shows an incredible naivety in these complaints, because the British, the French, and the Americans do not have to provide these weapons to Ukraine. It is Ukraine, after all, that is pleading and begging for these weapons all the time. And it is entirely understandable that the British, the French, and the Americans, who have broader interests than just Ukraine, are not prepared to allow their weapons to be used in the way that Zaluzhny apparently wants, a kind of unconstrained total war between Ukraine and Russia. I would add, by the way, that if Zaluzhny were to get his wish, if this were to become the kind of total war that he appears to hanker for, given the colossal mismatch of resources between Ukraine and Russia, it would not actually work out at all well for Ukraine. The Russians would respond with far more aggressive tactics, like, for example, destroying the Dnieper bridges, which they absolutely now have the capability to do. The missile strike on the Antonovsky Bridge, the Iskander missile strike on the Antonovsky Bridge, showed that they do have that kind of capability. Anyway, they could launch attacks of that kind. They could launch attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure that are far more devastating than those that they have launched up to now. They could engage in aerial bombing. They could do in all kinds of things. And I think that Zaluzhny, as I said, is being doubly naive in thinking that the Western powers will in fact give him the kind of blank check that he's looking for, and will simply ignore the possibility of this conflict escalating all the way up to a nuclear war. There is no way that the British, the French, the Americans will simply walk away from those sort of concerns, whatever they decide to do. And at the same time, he is being naive about the Russian reaction if he's allowed to do what he wants. Of course, as I said, he has done it to some extent already, but the extent of these attacks has been limited, and the Russians have parried it, and they've shown, for example, a considerable ability to shoot down Storm Shadow missiles, and I've no doubt the same will apply to the Scalp missiles that the French are going to supply, which are, to all intents and purposes, identical to the Storm Shadow missiles. And it will also be true if the United States does eventually get round to shooting down the ATACMS missiles. On the subject of the Storm Shadow missiles, I've seen a report that Britain has in fact provided Ukraine with its entire stock of these missiles, which would be several hundred of them. Now, I hope that isn't true, because heavens knows what Britain will do without missiles of its own. But there is no doubt at all that the British commitment to Storm Shadow missiles has been very substantial indeed, and it has not had the dramatic effect that many people perhaps anticipated. Anyway, Zaluzhny then comes back to the latest Ukrainian obsession, and he says that Ukraine still lacks resources to liberate all occupied territories and minimize casualties. And he's extremely critical of the refusal, or at least the reluctance, of some people to provide F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. And he again says that Western allies would never fight a war the way that they're expecting Ukraine to do. And on the subject of F-16s, we've now had some comments from a U.S. Defense Department official, and this person is Lieutenant General Douglas Sims, who is the Director of Operations of the Joint Staff, and he's reported to have said the following. He says, battlefield conditions in Ukraine are currently not ideal for the employment of F-16 fighter jets. Conditions right now for the employment of the F-16s are probably not ideal. I mean, the Russians still possess some air defense capability. They have air capability, and the number of F-16s that would be provided may not be perfect for what's going on right now. Now, General Sims did say that this is an evolving situation, that the situation on the ground is changing all the time, and that does leave open the possibility that perhaps a more ideal time might come when F16s might be provided to Ukraine. I'm going to say that General Sims knows perfectly well that the latter is not the case. It's been a very long time now since the Russians suffered significant air losses in Ukraine. Most of their air force, he talks about an air capability, Russians having an air capability. Most of the Russian air force is completely intact. The Russians, in fact, are increasing the number of fighter jets that they have in the theatre. There have been reports from General Shoigu, the defense minister, that Russian production of fighter jets has essentially doubled. I've seen reports of more Sukhoi 30 advanced fighter jets, multi-role aircraft, and Sukhoi 35s being supplied. It's clear that Russia actually has more fighter jets in the theatre than it did at the start of the conflict in February 2022. So if he's waiting for the day when the Russian Air Force is weakened, well, that's not coming. On the contrary, it is getting stronger. And the same seems to apply to the Russian air defense system. I don't recall, from memory, a single instance when Ukraine has successfully destroyed one of the bigger, more powerful Russian air defense systems, the Russian S-300s, which are much more advanced than the Ukrainian ones, and the Russian S-400s. Both of which are now present in considerable numbers on the battlefields. And I don't recall an instance where Ukraine has destroyed any one of these, any launches of any of these systems, or even any of the radar sets. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but I can't remember a single case when that has happened. For the record, I don't remember any instance where Ukraine has managed to destroy a Russian Buk surface-to-air missile system. This is a less powerful missile system than the S-300s and the S-400s. It's used by Russia and Ukraine, by the way, to support ground troops rather than being an area weapon like the S-300s and the S-400s. But again, I don't recall that Ukraine has been successful in destroying any one of these. And Ukraine has managed to destroy some of Russia's point defense systems, the Tor and the Pantsir, though not, it must be said, in any very significant quantities. And one gets the sense that the Russians, again, have been able to replace whatever units they've lost with what I suspect is very greatly increased production. But regardless, the Russians don't seem to have any significant shortage of these systems. So these point defense systems are also there on the battlefronts, doing their job for the Russians in all sorts of places and locations along the battle lines. So General Sims, when he says that this is an evolving situation, is expecting Russian Air Force capabilities and Russian air defense capabilities to reduce. He must know, unless he's getting completely false information, that the reality is the opposite. So we come back to his words. He says that the battlefield conditions in Ukraine are currently not ideal for the employment of F-16 fighters. he seems to imply that F-16 fighters should not be supplied to Ukraine until conditions do become ideal. To say it simply and straightforwardly, I wonder whether that will ever happen, whether that will ever be the case, and I wonder whether General Sims himself actually thinks it will ever be the case. For the record, West European countries, the Netherlands, which is supposed to lead in this program, are now saying that they have not yet actually received permission from the United States for training to start of Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. So, for the moment at least, despite certain words by Jake Sullivan, for example, at the time of the Vilnius summit, in which he seemed to suggest that the F-16s would indeed be on their way, it looks as if the Pentagon, for its part, has cooled on this idea. It doesn't really see this idea as a workable one, at least at the moment, and General Sims is now saying that maybe conditions are not ideal and is implying that they should not be supplied at all. And I gather that Australia has also somewhat cooled on the idea of supplying its old F-18s, and therefore we have a situation overall where perhaps, most probably, Ukraine will eventually get fighter jets, but certainly not whilst the current offensive is underway, and probably not this year. It's starting to look as if these fighter jets will not arrive in Ukraine or on the Ukrainian battlefields before the winter or perhaps even the spring of 2024. So, Zaluzhny may be angry about the fact that he is not getting his fighters, but that does seem to be the reality. That seems to be the decision. And it's not just a case of fighter jets not being provided by the United States. This isn't just the issue now. Zaluzhny is also angry. He expresses anger about the fact that there are people who are pushing in the West, who are pushing back about Crimea. He reiterates in his Washington Post interview that Ukraine's goal remains to liberate, as he puts it, Russian-occupied Crimea. This appears to be an obsession, personal obsession of Zaluzhny's, and indeed of the entire Ukrainian leadership. Again, he shows no interest or regard for worries in the West about the kind of escalation, potential escalation that might result in on the part of the Russians if an attack on Crimea of the kind that Zaluzhny apparently hankers for were to take place. And he insists that as soon as I have the means, I'll do something. I don't give a damn. Nobody will stop me. Now, those last words ought to fill people in Washington and London and Paris and Berlin and Brussels with concern, because they show the fact that in supporting Ukraine, they have in effect a tiger by the tail. They have a Ukrainian military, which is, to all intents and purposes, out of control. It demands unlimited amounts of weapon systems. We've already seen that the United States has run out of unitary 155mm ammunition because of the vast amounts it supplied to Ukraine. In the case of the United States' European allies, the situation is even worse. They too are out of ammunition. Alongside the United States, they've given Ukraine vast quantities of guns, depleting to a disastrous degree their own. I'm hearing, by the way, reports that the US the US artillery people are now forced to train with shells with concrete warheads because they've run out of real shells to train with. I'm not sure that this report is true, by the way, or even that it means anything. Perhaps artillery people always train with shells with concrete warheads. I don't know. But anyway, regardless of that, I have seen some figures, and if one looks at the amount of equipment objectively that Ukraine has received from the West, by now it is staggering. The quantities of tanks, for example, that Ukraine has been provided seem to be on a similar scale to those of various Western armies, French, German, British, except, of course, and it should be stressed, the bulk of these are not Western tanks. They're tanks from Eastern Europe, old Soviet tanks left over from the Cold War, new production tanks built in Poland and in the Czech Republic, and the former Yugoslavia, which have been either converted or modernized or built in factories that still exist and still function in these countries. But regardless, on any measure, Ukraine has received an enormous flood of weapons. And, of course, not just weapons, but intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance equipment. It's communications work on the Starlink system. Chancellor Scholz of Germany now says that Ukraine's military spending now exceeds the total amount of its pre-war budget, and it's only able to sustain this because of the financial help it is getting from the West. That's probably an understatement, by the way. But anyway, despite all of this, despite this unlimited supply of weapons and radar systems and intelligence and all the rest, here we have General Zaluzhny. He comes back, he demands more. He has unlimited demands of the number of the amount of equipment and machines that he should be given. He said in his interview with The Economist in September last year that he needed 300 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers to recapture Crimea. In terms of pure numbers, he probably got something close to those numbers, except perhaps in guns. And the reason he hasn't had more guns is because the West hasn't had enough guns to give him. But they've given him practically all their ammunition. And what does he do? He says it's not enough. He makes it sound like the West is under some sort of duty or obligation to go on providing even more to satisfy his unlimited requests. He said back in September that he needed 300 tanks and 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles and 500 howitzers to liberate Crimea. He's, as I said, received most of that. He's no closer to liberating Crimea than he was in September, perhaps less so, given that the offensive isn't going well. But as I said, instead of pulling back, he demands still more. And he says, don't just give me everything I want, also let me fight my war the way I want to. Let me launch missile strikes on Moscow. Let me do whatever I choose. And if you are worried that that kind of activity, those kind of operations, might result in World War III, a nuclear war, well, I don't give a damn. That's what he says. I don't give a damn. And nobody will stop me. Is this the sort of person that you should be giving all that military equipment to and giving unconditional support to? Well, I would have thought not. Well, there is now clear pushback in some places, and an official of the US Department of Defense has now come forward and has given a briefing to Congress, apparently, in which he's actually said that things don't look particularly good. And this is again from Bloomberg. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia has reached a stalemate, a senior US intelligence official said, offering a downbeat assessment of a counteroffensive that some US and European leaders had hoped would turn the tide in Kiev's favour. I have to say the word some is a curious one, because when he's talking about the political leaders, they were overwhelmingly hopeful and expectant that this counteroffensive would turn things in Ukraine's favour. But anyway, to continue. Certainly we are at a bit of a stalemate. John Kirchhofer, the US Defense Intelligence Agency Chief of Staff, said at a conference in Washington on Thursday. Now, before I proceed, I'm going to say that the United States has lots of intelligence agencies. For the record, I think that the two least politicized and most reliable in terms of providing intelligence information to the US government are the Defense Intelligence Agency, formerly headed, by the way, once upon a time, in Obama's day, by Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who was briefly Donald Trump's national security advisor, just saying, and also the National Security Agency, which may get up to all sorts of things that many of us might consider illegal, but which nonetheless, I think, does its job efficiently. But anyway, that's my own view. Anyway, certainly we're in a bit of a stalemate, John Kirchhofer said at a conference in Washington on Thursday. One of the things that the Russian leadership believes is that they can outlast the support of the West. And we go on to read that Kirchhofer was similarly downbeat about Ukraine's demand for more and more powerful weapons from the United States and its allies. He cited the US decision to send cluster bombs and HIMARS rocket systems to the United States, as well as the United Kingdom's provision of Storm Shadow missiles. And he went on to say, none of these, unfortunately, are the holy grail that Ukrainians looking for that will allow them to break through. So, apparently, he doesn't think that any weapon system the West can supply is going to change the outcome of the war. And if that's his advice, and as I said, that's the advice of the Defense Intelligence Agency, taken together with what Zaluzhny is saying, why continue to send weapons and equipment to Ukraine at all? You are delivering weapons and equipment to a military whose commander, General Zaluzhny, comes back endlessly demanding ever more weapons. He sets maximalist and impossible goals. He seems to hanker for some kind of total war against Russia, which, by the way, he will lose, putting you in an even more difficult position than you would be otherwise. And as he said, he doesn't give a damn about your concerns about nuclear war. He will go on, do whatever he wants, whatever he thinks, and he will just press on relentlessly. Now, General Zaluzhny does come across to me as sometimes amongst Ukrainian leaders as being slightly more connected to reality. I believe, for example, that his mysterious disappearance that lasted for several weeks, but which, by the way, note, is now ended, was largely the product of his disagreement with the launch of an offensive without air cover and without a lot more artillery and artillery support than the West has provided. But in terms of his ideology and his political goals, it seems to me that he is in no sense different than the rest of the Ukrainian political leadership. He insists on maximalist goals, liberation of Crimea, total defeat of Russia, and he expects the West, with that astonishing sense of entitlement that the Ukrainian leadership brings to this conflict, he expects the West to give him everything he wants in order to achieve those maximalist goals. And when he's told that he can't have it, he responds rather like a spoiled child. He says he's, instead of being, well, recognizing that the other side, that the West has limits upon what it can do, he gets angry and resentful, and as I said, as we saw a few months ago, goes into a sulk and refuses to cooperate. And when he is given what he wants, he says, well, in that case, he's going to do whatever he likes. He's going to pay no attention to Western concerns, no attention to Western fears. He's going to expand the war into a total war. He's going to attack Crimea. He's going to do all sorts of things. And fears about nuclear war, fears about escalation of the war out of control, fears like that be damned. Was it ever sensible to provide support to a military who has a leader like that, towards a political leadership with a leader like Zelensky, who essentially says the same thing? Well, that, it seems to me, is the trap into which the Western powers have maneuvered themselves into. And when I say that the West has maneuvered itself into this trap, it's notwithstanding lots of warning lights, lots of warnings and indications along the way that this was indeed a trap. Anybody who has studied or paid any attention to the history or the political events in Ukraine since at least the time of the Orange Revolution back in, I think, 2004, will know that a characteristic of what I will loosely call the Maidan movement, because it was very much centered on protests against governments that it didn't like in Maidan Square, was that it set itself maximalist positions at all times, never was prepared to retreat from them, never recognized the legitimacy of other points of view, never accepted any constraints or limitations upon its conduct or behavior, be it political or otherwise, and came along with a colossal sense of entitlement in terms of support that it should get or receive from the West. To be very clear, the Maidan movement was not a monolith, and there have always been, no doubt, more sensible people, or at least more moderate people within it, and there have been many, many people who have at various times lent it its support, who have done so without necessarily buying into its maximalist demands, but because they want an independent, prosperous, and European-oriented Ukraine, and that has always been a legitimate aspiration. But what has happened, or so it seems to me, is that unconstrained Western support has consistently worked to the advantage of the maximalists and undercut the more moderate, I would say, rational forces. Given that the maximalists, up to this point, have always and invariably been given whatever they want, a green light, for example, to carry out the violent overthrow of President Yanukovych's government in 2014, a green light to launch what they called their anti-terrorist operation against Donbass in 2014, whilst negotiations for a resolution of the crisis in Ukraine were supposed to be underway, a green light to disregard commitments reached at Minsk, both Minsk I and perhaps more importantly Minsk II, notwithstanding that Minsk II provided a clear route map for how the internal crisis in Ukraine could be resolved. And despite the fact that Minsk II is a part of international law, having been made so by a special resolution, a resolution of the United Nations Security Council. Notwithstanding all of this evidence, the West has basically gone along with everything that the maximalists have wanted to do, and now we see the results. General Zaluzhny, President Zelensky, they come back, they demand more and more and more. They want F16s, they want more guns, more tanks, more ammunition, more of all of these machines. They want all limits on their war with Russia to be lifted, and they're not bothered if their actions might lead to risks of nuclear war. To repeat again what Zaluzhny has said, as soon as I have the means, I'll do something. I don't give a damn. Nobody will stop me. Those are his words. They're there, black and white, in that interview in the Washington Post. Well, it's perhaps not surprising that even as the military balance shifts remorselessly against Ukraine, its constant attempts at offensives, that conducting this offensive, well, as we've been told now by John Kirchhofer of the Defense Intelligence Agency, is at stalemate. The Ukrainians can't break through. No miracle weapons are going to change that situation. And I should stress again, and here I want to repeat a point made already by Larry Johnson, this is not really a stalemate at all. That is the euphemism that some Western officials have come up with to acknowledge the greater reality that Ukraine's offensive has failed, and that before very long the initiative will start to tilt towards the Russians. Larry Johnson made the entirely correct point that even as the West runs out of ammunition, runs out of hardware to send to Ukraine, even as Ukraine's economy now becomes totally dependent on that of the West, even as Ukraine runs out of trained manpower, there may be lots of men still who can still be called up and sent after 2 or 3 weeks to fill out the regiments and hurled into battle. But these men are less and less trained than the predecessors that they replace, and it looks as if trained manpower is now running catastrophically short in Ukraine. Even as this is happening, the Russian build-up continues. And of course, the fundamental difference and the big difference between the offensives that Ukraine launched last autumn and this particular offensive is not just that the Russians have built up extensive minefields and elaborate fortifications. We've seen that even in places like Bakhmut, where one can't talk about extensive minefields or fortifications, Ukraine is still finding it incredibly difficult to achieve any sort of breakthrough. In fact, it's not managed in any part of the fronts to reach the major Russian fortified lines built by the Russians in the autumn and winter and spring. So it's not just a question of minefields and fortifications. What's more important is that the Russians have trained reserves, so that when a Ukrainian attack does achieve a small breakthrough here or there, the Russians are able to launch counterattacks, they're able to recover lost ground, they're able to stabilize their front lines, they're able to replace losses, they're able to continue to shell Ukrainian troops in every sort of position. That wasn't the case last autumn. At the time of the Kharkiv offensive, as I've discussed many times, the number of Russian troops in the Kharkiv region when Ukraine attacked was very small, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 regular army troops. The remainder were made up of militia and troops drawn from Russia's National Guard, which is more an internal security force than a proper military force. And that meant that when Ukraine broke through the front line in places like Balakleya and wherever, Russia simply didn't have the numbers of troops, the troops in reserve, the brigades and battalions and companies in reserve to be able to launch counterattacks, to drive back the Ukrainian breakthroughs, to close the gaps in the front line. Whereas now it does. And it's been doing that repeatedly every day since this offensive began. And that is why we have not seen a major Ukrainian breakthrough anywhere on the front lines. And of course, in the meantime, the artillery, the minefields, the aircraft, the fighter jets, the bombers, the precision-guided bombs that the Russians have, they're able to make a massive difference. They're able to inflict enormous damage upon Ukraine and terrible casualties on the Ukrainian troops. Meanwhile, the aftershock of the events in Vilnius, the NATO summit in Vilnius, continues to echo around Western capitals. And one example could very well be the news that the British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, may be the latest victim of what my colleague Alex Christoforou calls the Zelensky curse. Apparently there are reports that he's intending to step down from the British cabinet in September. In other words, he's going to cease being British Defence Secretary. And he's also apparently thinking of leaving politics entirely. He's apparently not going to seek re-election as an MP, a British MP, at the next general election, which is due to take place perhaps sometime next year. Anyway, we shall see. These are reports circulating and that they're appearing in the London Times, and it seems as if they're probably reliable. Ben Wallace, by the way, I should say, was at one point seriously considered and was potentially in the running for the position of leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. And this is very much on the back of his apparently unqualified support for Ukraine as British Defence Secretary and the extremely strong position that he took against the Russians. Well, that strong position has left the British military, the British Army especially, stripped of its weapons. Apparently its entire fleet, or most of it, of self-propelled guns has all been sent to Ukraine, where several of them have already been destroyed. Lots of armoured vehicles that Britain had have been shipped to Ukraine. 12, or maybe it was 14, Challenger 2 tanks with attendant ammunition have been sent to Ukraine out of what is already a rapidly reducing British tank fleet. There was a report in the Daily Mail about a week ago that the British Army only has 40 operational tanks, Challenger 2s, left. And of course, if the reports are also true, that Britain has supplied Ukraine with most of its Storm Shadow missiles, well, that probably has left the Air Force, the British Air Force, in a complicated position, which is in that it is perhaps no longer fully capable of the kind of long-range strikes which the Storm Shadows were designed and built for. I suspect, if it is true that Ben Wallace is indeed thinking of resigning in September, and all of the indications are that he is and probably will go in September, that what happened in Vilnius for him may very well have been the last straw. After having stripped the British Army, as I said, of many of its most needed weapons, he turns up in Vilnius and gets all these incredibly bitter statements from Zelensky about the fact that Ukraine isn't being fast-tracked into NATO, endless demands from the Ukrainians for more and more weapons. He's reported to have told Zelensky that he needed to show gratitude, and he said that on one occasion he himself had driven 11 hours, apparently, to attend a meeting with Ukrainian officials, only to be presented with another unlimited shopping list of military supplies. I say shopping list, though of course Ukraine is getting all of these weapons on credit, a credit it will never pay for. But anyway, an unlimited shopping list of weapons, which elicited from Ben Wallace, who is, by the way, for all his other faults, an extremely polite and courteous man. It elicited from Ben Wallace the now famous comment that he was not Amazon, and nor is the United States. So apparently Ben Wallace is now intending to go, and I wonder whether this exchange with Zelensky, which is so much of a piece with Zaluzhny's comments that I've just been discussing, may very well have been the tipping point, the thing that finally decided him to quit as Defence Secretary and to leave politics altogether. I want to stress I haven't any inside information about this. It may be that Mr. Wallace is retiring for entirely different reasons. But anyway, it's a fact that it does seem to be a fact that he is probably going. And I, for one, would not be surprised if it was this exchange with Zelensky, as I said, that made his decision final. Anyway, there's other things going on in the world. And yesterday, President Erdogan made a statement that he and President Putin are in agreement that the grain deal should be extended. And he again repeated that in August, President Putin is expected to come to Turkey. Well, Russia maintained a stony silence in face of these comments until eventually Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov came out and said that in fact Russia has made no statements at all about the extension of the grain deal. And as of this time of making this video, there's still no readout on the Kremlin website of any discussions, of any telephone conversation between President Erdogan and President Putin. And there's now reports by TASS that the Russians are studying the UN General Secretary's latest letter and are considering what he's proposing. But if that letter doesn't satisfy their concerns about the grain deal, they will go ahead and pull out of it tomorrow. So it looks as if President Erdogan tried to bounce Putin into some kind of an agreement to extend the grain deal, and the Russians again are not pleased. And I would add that for the moment at least, there is still no proper confirmation that President Putin is travelling to Turkey in August at all. I'm not even sure, by the way, that there's even been a conversation, a telephone conversation between Erdogan and Putin. Perhaps there has, and it may be that in light of Erdogan's comments, the Russians are taking time to decide on the wording of their readout. Anyway, we will see what happens. Has been pointed out to me that there is another reason why Erdogan might have been angry with Putin, and which might have caused him to receive Zelensky with so much enthusiasm, to support apparently Zelensky's cause for Ukraine to be admitted into NATO, and also to agree or to sign an agreement for co-production in Ukraine of Turkish Bayraktar drones. One of the largely forgotten aspects of the Syrian war is that UN convoys delivering what they call humanitarian aid to northern Syria pass from Turkey, from southern Turkey into Syria through a checkpoint at a place called Bab al-Hawa. And the point is that this particular checkpoint has continues to be controlled by the Turkish military on the Turkish side and by the Turkish-backed insurgents who have been fighting President Assad's government in this part of northern Syria, largely Idlib province, on the Syrian side of the border. And this has been the practice now for a long time. It was agreed several years ago, but every so often the agreement, this arrangement that the UN convoys pass through this particular checkpoint has to be ratified, has to be approved by the UN Security Council. Well, last week, Russia vetoed a renewal of this arrangement, which means that UN convoys, at least in theory, cannot continue to use this particular checkpoint, the Bab al-Hawa checkpoint. And it could be that they will now have to cross into Syria through Syrian government-controlled territory, rather than through territory previously controlled, in effect, by Turkey on the Turkish side of the border, and by Turkish-backed insurgents on the Syrian side of the border. And of course, the distribution of the humanitarian aid, once it arrived in Syria, since it had to pass through territory controlled by the Turkish-backed insurgents, was largely controlled in northern Syria by those insurgents, and to a certain extent, given Turkey's leverage over these insurgents, by the Turkish government as well. Now that's going to end, and control is going to pass to the Syrian government. That's always, of course, assuming that the UN complies with the spirit and letter of the resolution and ceases to use this crossing, which I suspect is likely. And I can understand why Erdogan would not be pleased with this, that the Russians have in effect vetoed a situation where he, whether directly or indirectly, controls the distribution of humanitarian supplies in northern Syria, and that this might have been a factor that turned him against the Russians over the last few weeks. I say that because though this decision was only made last week by the Security Council, I'm assuming that the Russians communicated it to all of the interested powers, the various member states of the UN present on the UN Security Council, and the UN Secretariat, and most probably to the Turkish authorities, to the Turkish government in advance. And given how important this issue has been for Erdogan, it's probably likely that it was this more than anything else that made him angry, and may have been a key factor, along with US promises of financial support and of advanced F-16 fighters, that may have caused him to take the stance that he did. Having said that, Erdogan also knows that he can't antagonize the Russians entirely, and that might also explain why, on the one hand, he's so keen to get the Russians to agree to Putin visiting Turkey in August, and why at the same time he wants the grain deal extended, because again, the grain deal, in a kind of a way, provides him with a kind of leverage over the Russians. Anyway, we will see what happens over this affair. As I said yesterday, I personally will be extremely surprised if the grain deal is indeed extended. It seemed to me that President Putin's comments on Thursday, to all intents and purposes, ruled that out. Maybe they will look at what Guterres had to propose, but it seemed to me that the reports that I've seen of Guterres' letter suggest that his proposals are unworkable. And besides, the Russians must wonder whether the Western powers will ever fulfill whatever obligations are supposedly set out for them in this letter. It's not as if Guterres is in any position to oblige the Western powers to agree to do whatever he wants them to do. I would add, by the way, that Guterres, his position, it seems to me, has quietly shifted over the course of the war. Back in the first weeks of the fighting, he seemed to me to be taking a fairly clear-cut stance supporting Ukraine, and very close, or essentially identical to that of the West. I get the sense that over time, he's gradually adjusted his position and seems to be working more closely with the Russians. The Russians, Putin specifically, have gone out of their way to say that he has acted with sincerity throughout the negotiations over the grain deal. And incidentally, there have been criticisms of Guterres in the United States that he is making too many concessions to the Russians. And of course, those concessions have to be in connection with the grain deal. And that perhaps explains to us why the grain deal has never really worked, because the hardliners in Washington have never been willing to make it work. They have instead used the grain deal, as I said yesterday, to try to string the Russians along, but they have no intention of ever watering down any sanctions, including the sanctions that delisted, that disconnected the Russian Agricultural Bank from SWIFT, by way of just one example. So that perhaps provides us with some understanding of Erdogan's decisions. And there have been other things. It looks as if Wagner, or at least some of the people within Wagner, have now finally decided that Putin is going to be immovable in his support of the Russian Defense Ministry in this quarrel between Prigozhin and the Russian Defense Ministry, and that the Wagner fighters will indeed have to sign contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry if they are going to continue operations in Ukraine. The only alternative for them, if they're not prepared to do that, is to go to Belarus, and there have now been sightings of convoys of Wagner vehicles driving towards Belarus, and of course there's been more reports that Wagner fighters are engaged in training of Belarus troops. So it does look as if Wagner, as we have known it, is now essentially dismantled. Perhaps a cadre, a core of Wagner fighters will remain in Russia and be assimilated into the Russian armed forces. But it does look as if Prigozhin continues to have some kind of sway over a hard core of fighters and their commanders, and that they're now decanting to Belarus. And my own view is that this story of Wagner, in terms of the Ukraine war, is now, to all intents and purposes, over. The last piece of news, which I'm going to just touch on very briefly, is that there's now an accumulation of reports that the meeting, the BRICS summit meeting in South Africa, is indeed going to be an in-person meeting, and that the South African authorities apparently expect that President Putin himself will attend that summit meeting in person. So it looks as if South Africa has made a decision to disregard the ICC warrant. Now that, of course, begs the question of whether Putin himself will want to travel to South Africa if he gets assurances from the South African authorities that the warrant will not be executed whilst he is in South Africa, and South Africa passed a decision granting all participants in this summit meeting diplomatic immunity, which of course would include Putin, and seems to provide the legal basis for them not to execute this warrant. Well, there's still the concern which I think is a real one, that steps might be taken along the way to intercept his aircraft. I know that sounds off the scale, and it would be incredibly dangerous and reckless, but given the kind of people we see, not just in Ukraine, but in the West, I'm not convinced that this is an entirely safe trip for Putin to undertake. And I do wonder whether or not he will in the end undertake it. The Russians are still silent about this. But on one issue, there is no doubt whatsoever. It does seem that he will indeed be travelling to Beijing in October, and that looks like a most important summit meeting. Latest reports show that Russia is now China's fourth biggest trading partner. Trade between China and Russia is surging. It's still only at about half the level, or a third of the level, of trade between China and the United States. But even that factor tells us how dramatic this increase in trade between these two countries has become. And last but not least, it seems that following OPEC plus production cuts, which have led to a steep cutback in Russian crude oil exports, it seems that Urals crude, which is the global price of Urals crude, the benchmark, the used in the West for Russian oil, not necessarily in East Asia, by the way, well, that has now passed, it's now broken through the $60 a barrel cap that the G7 states pretended that they'd imposed at the start of this year. And we're talking now about the global price. In East Asian markets, Russian oil has traded above the cap for some time. Anyway, there we go. That's the situation at present. Whether General Zaluzhny's comments, how well received they're going to be in Washington and London and Paris and Berlin and Brussels, I don't know. But we've seen a vivid example with them of the state of the sense of entitlement and the absence of restraint that Ukraine and its leadership, or rather the Ukrainian leadership, have shown, not just throughout this particular war, but in all the years of the conflict that preceded it, and which are major factors, by the way, have been perhaps the single most important factor in causing the war. And even as I have been making this program, there's been a report from Russia's primary internal security agency that they have detected and prevented assassination attempts on two Russian journalists, Margarita Simonyan, who is the head of RT, and perhaps rather surprisingly, Ksenia Sobchak, an independently minded journalist in Russia, who is and has often been a very strong critic of President Putin. And I'm not entirely sure why the Ukrainians would want to assassinate her. Anyway, that is a developing story, and I will no doubt return to it in my next program. But in the meantime, this is where I finish. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also go to our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, more from me soon, and have a very good day.